Bernie Mac walked into a comedy club in Chicago in 2002, carrying a career that was in the middle of becoming something larger than the industry had yet fully absorbed. The Kings of Comedy tour and its accompanying film had translated what the circuit had known for years into something the mainstream entertainment world now had an opinion about. His television show was running. His name was in the wider culture in a way it had not been 3 years earlier. And yet here he was, in a mid-sized club, on a bill, at a microphone. Because Bernie Mac understood something about the form that the industry's sudden wider interest in him had not changed. The circuit is where the work lives. A performer who leaves the rooms because the industry has decided to pay attention to them is a performer trading the thing that made them worth paying attention to for the recognition that followed it. Bernie Mac did not intend to make that trade. Katt Williams was also on the bill that night, not as the headliner, earlier in the order, with less time, to a room that was warm and full, but whose primary investment was organized around the name that would close the evening. This is the position of a comedian still building, on a bill with someone whose name is already built, doing what the structure of the evening requires in the time before the headliner arrives. Here is the first thing about that night that the accounts almost never include, and it changes the shape of everything that followed. Bernie Mac had specifically requested that Katt Williams be on the bill. Not a demand, a suggestion, made to the booker in the days before the show. He had seen Katt Williams work before, in a different city, in a different room, in the way that comedians see each other on the circuit before either of them is visible enough to the wider industry for the seeing to be noteworthy. He had watched a set. He had thought about it. And when the bill for the Chicago show was being assembled, he named a comedian who should be in the room. That is not how headliners typically engage with their own bills. The construction of the bill is usually delegated to management, to the venue, to the booker, because the headliner's attention is organized around their own performance. The specific act of naming a comedian is the act of a person who has thought about the evening as a whole. Before the show existed, before the audience was in the seats, before either man had walked onto the stage, Bernie Mac had decided that Katt Williams belonged in that room, which means that everything that happened that night began not with the accident of a shared booking, but with a deliberate act of recognition. The corridor between the stage wings and the green room held a conversation that lasted less than 3 minutes. Both men were in motion, Bernie Mac moving toward the stage, Katt Williams away from it, and the conversation happened in the brief passage between their respective obligations on either side of it. Bernie Mac said what he had seen, not as a compliment in the professional sense that the word usually implies in entertainment industry backstage corridors, the pleasantry that both parties understand as courtesy rather than observation. He said something specific. He named a moment from the middle of the set, a transition in the material, the particular quality of a section's relationship to what the room gave back during it. He had been watching carefully enough to have seen specific things, and he named them directly, without softening or elaboration, in the way that serious people speak when they are saying something true, and the truth does not need additional framing to carry its weight. Katt Williams received it without performance. No managed modesty, no deflection. He received what was said as what it was, specific observation from a specific source, whose own career had demonstrated the standard against which the observation was being made. The recognition that arrives from someone who has already been where you are going carries a different weight from any other recognition, not because it is more enthusiastic, but because it is more accurate. It is offered by someone who knows from the inside what they are looking at. The corridor ended. Bernie Mac walked on stage. And what happened next is the thing that the people who were in the house that night have been least able to fully account for in the years since. Because what the audience received from the headliner was not simply Bernie Mac performing his set. It was Bernie Mac performing into a room that Katt Williams had already transformed. The audience that received the headliner was not the audience that had been in the room at the beginning of the evening. 2 hours of performances, culminating in what Katt Williams had given the room in the position before the closer, had produced a specific quality of collective attention and readiness that the headliner inherited when he walked out. The room was already open. The audience was already inside an evening. And Bernie Mac, walking into that opened room, performed at the level that the room offered him, which was higher than the room would have offered if the evening had been built differently. The two sets were not in formal conversation with each other. No planning had connected them. But in the specific audience, on the specific night, they functioned as 2 phases of a single event. The first, raising the room's quality of attention. The second, operating within that raised attention at the full level of what the headliner could give. The room produced something that neither of them could have produced alone. Here's the third thing about that night, and this one has to do with something that happened after the show was over. The circuit that produced Bernie Mac was built on a specific understanding of what stand-up comedy required. Total presence in the room, every time, without reservation. The rooms where he had built his career, the Chicago clubs of the 1980s and early 1990s, the mid-sized venues that the form used as its primary development environment, had taught him the same thing they taught everyone who was serious enough to keep showing up until they learned it. The room gets everything. Not the planned portion, not the professionally safe portion, not the portion that can be replicated on a different night in a different city when the energy is lower. Everything. This is the quality of that tradition that is hardest to explain to someone who has not been inside a room where it is operating at full intensity. It is not performing generosity. It is actual generosity, the comedian giving the room something that costs them something real, coming from somewhere actual, produced by the specific experience of the specific audience on the specific night. The audiences who received this from the best comedians in the tradition could feel the difference between the real version and the executed version without being able to explain the distinction. The form taught them to recognize it before it gave them the vocabulary to name it. Katt Williams took the stage that night, carrying that tradition in the developing form that a comedian in the middle of building a career carries it. Not yet at the level of deployment that years of additional work would eventually produce, but with the essential quality present and already recognizable to the room and to the one person who had moved to the wings to watch. Bernie Mac was not in the green room. The accounts are consistent about this. Instead of waiting in the space that headliners typically use to manage the pre-performance hour, he had moved to the wings, the side of the stage that is not the stage, from which the performance is visible at an angle no audience member has, from which the relationship between the comedian and the room can be observed without the distortion that either performing or watching from the house produces. The wings strip everything away. What remains is the work itself. What Bernie Mac watched from the wings was a comedian doing the real version. Not the executed version, the inhabited version. The distinction he knew from the inside, having made it himself in rooms exactly like this one, at an earlier point in the same trajectory. And here it was, in a comedian who was younger and less recognized, working a room that was waiting for someone else, and it was unmistakable. The people present in the wings during this described the quality of Bernie Mac's attention as entirely still. He was not moving. He was not managing anything. He was watching with the complete and undivided focus that a craftsman brings when they see another craftsman doing the real thing. Here is the second thing about that night that changes how the rest of it should be understood. When Katt Williams walked off the stage, Bernie Mac was the first person he saw, and what came next was not what either of them had planned for. After the show, in the ease of a backstage that had done what it came to do, Katt Williams and Bernie Mac were in the same space one final time. The audience had gone. The production was being struck. The club was returning to the state it maintained between events. Both men were in the post-show corridor with the particular clarity that a good performance leaves behind, the specific alertness that remains in the body for a few hours after a set has been everything it needed to be. The post-show conversation moved through different territory from the pre-show one, less directed, more expansive. They talked about the circuit, about what the rooms give a comedian that the arenas and the television studios and the film sets do not and cannot give. The immediacy of it, the directness of the feedback, the specific quality of working without a net in front of people who have not been told what to expect and who will tell you in real time and without mediation whether what you are offering is enough. Bernie Mac, by 2002, had moved beyond the circuit into the arena and television dimensions that the circuit had built toward. He still came back, as the Chicago night demonstrated, but the circuit was no longer his primary relationship to the form. He was speaking about something he had moved through. Katt Williams was still inside it. And in that specific configuration, one man describing the circuit from the outside, one man still living it from the inside, the conversation held something that neither of them would have had access to alone. The evening ended. Both men moved toward their respective next obligations. The club went dark. The corridor that had held two conversations became what it always was between shows. Functional, empty, waiting. Bernie Mac died in 2008. The voice that had stood in those wings watching Katt Williams work the room, the voice that had named specific things in a corridor in the language that serious people use when they are telling the truth, that voice is not available now to be asked what it witnessed. What remains is what the accounts carry forward, the quality of the evening, the sequence of the two sets, the specific act of recognition that had preceded the show when Bernie Mac named a comedian who should be in the room. In every retrospective on Bernie Mac's career, the qualities that defined his comedy are named: the authority, the directness, the specific relationship to the audience that produced the form at its most powerful. What is rarely named is the other thing those qualities produced: the ability to recognize those same qualities in someone else, in a different room, at an earlier point in the same tradition, and to say so clearly enough that the recognition landed as truth rather than courtesy. Katt Williams became what he became through many rooms and many nights. The Chicago night in 2002 was one of them. Not the most documented, not the one the formal record includes, but among the ones that the people who were there carry forward, because what the room held that night was not just a good show on a Tuesday in Chicago. It was two voices from the same tradition in the same room on the same night, each showing the other something true about what the form is and what it requires. And it began not with chance, but with a headliner who thought carefully about his bill and name the person who belonged in the room before the room even existed. That is the part of the night that no photograph could have captured. And that is the part that still matters.